Great to have you all here in Nottingham. I hope Emily wasn't referring to Nottingham as the end of the earth when she said we'd all assembled here, but great to all have you here. I know some have travelled a bit further than others, but thanks very much for making the effort. Before I get into the slides, I've got a couple of thank yous. So Michelle, if you could come up. Michelle's done so much organising for us. So on behalf of TREvolution, thanks very much. And a little thing from the university. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are also some hidden heroes in the audience who, about a month ago, is when we first got the award letter. And that then means some poor people have to sort out finance, contracts, and all that sort of stuff. So there are some people here from the university. If you could stand up, University of Nottingham people who have made this all possible. Thank you very much for your efforts. We're obviously celebrating today the fact that we've launched and we're starting TREvolution, but really a month ago this wasn't even on the table. And to have an event now of going over 3 or 4 days in a venue with this with so many people coming is a big effort. So thanks, Michelle, for really helping, but thank you for the university teams. And obviously every partner involved in this project has university teams like that making this possible. So thanks to all of you for making that happen. So, I've got to work out which hand, go that way. The 3 things I want to focus on really are, we talk a lot about technology, and I'm a software engineer by training, so I like to think that software will always solve every problem, always. But we've got to recognize that just because something's technically possible doesn't necessarily mean it's acceptable. And what I mean by that, there's plenty of technology now available out there. You can do federated analytics easily. It's a solved technical challenge. You can do it. We have multiple ways of doing AI. That's available. But that doesn't mean necessarily that approach and those technologies are acceptable either to the public or for the governance rules that are in play or to the environments that are having to try and secure data. So just because something's possible doesn't make it acceptable in what we're trying to do. And the really depressing thing for software engineers, not all technology is even useful, right? So we can develop things that we think and love it. We think it's the best thing ever. But it doesn't always kind of translate to something that's actually useful to researchers. So one of the things that we've been trying to understand is the balance between these 3 things. What's possible, what's acceptable, but also what is useful, and this is what we're trying to bridge. And I guess what we're seeing more recently, particularly with trusted research environments, is a big shift in defining what is acceptable. So we are moving from data sharing, it's been seen as less acceptable when it comes to certain types of data, to data access. So we've had a big shift in the definition of what is acceptable. So we're basically saying it is acceptable to have access to very privileged and sensitive data, so long as it is in an environment that's been secured. And that's a change that's happening, and we've seen, and that's why you're getting this explosion of TREs across the countries, because that dynamic has shifted. It's no longer acceptable just to send data to somebody else and trust them that they're not going to onward share it or use it for other things. So we've seen a big change in that particular quadrant. So what is a TRE? If we take a default TRE, most of them will be underpinned by the 5 safes framework for how we get access to the data. But in general, there'll be a data repository where the data resides. A researcher analytical environment will be available, so that's where they can come into that environment and analyze that data. But the really important part is there's a disclosure control process. So if they want to bring anything in or out of that environment, it's checked before that movement occurs. And this is how we talk about data access from data sharing. We're no longer sharing the data, but we're providing that environment where people can log in and have access to that data and do the research that they want to do. So we talk a lot about federation. And there's always a challenge about what exactly do we mean by federation. And really, at its simplest, it's saying federation is where data exists in more than one environment. It's not all in one place. And most likely, each one of those environments will have their own jurisdiction, their own rules, their own access procedures. So when we talk about federation, it's just acknowledging there will be scenarios when we can't get all the data into one location and under one governance umbrella. So not thinking about it from a technology point of view, but purely just from a concept, that's what federation is. There is data in multiple environments under multiple control mechanisms. But we do have to acknowledge that's not necessarily the most useful approach. If you were to ask researchers what would they want, they'd want data in one location where all the compute is with one application form. Right? So the acceptable angle of this program, we've got trusted research environments, but if you were to ask researchers what's useful, that's not a very useful thing for them to do. And a lot of the time, it is completely technically possible to bring all that data to one location. You know, there's no technical reason why you can't bring the data from the 4 nations into one environment. But we don't live in that world. We have the 4 nations. We have data that is stored in different TREs, based on domain, based on country. And often, that's not even where the compute is. So we have high-performance computers and compute facilities that aren't the TREs. So we have a completely fragmented and federated ecosystem. So how do we make something useful in such an environment? So if we were now switching and saying, actually, let's not worry about sensitive data at the moment. Let's just think about non-sensitive data where there's a lot less controls. You would have some hardware, i.e. the computers that you want to run your analysis on. You would have that data available, and you'd be able to run some software to do that. And because this is non-sensitive data, we can just connect to the internet, we can install the software that we want to do. So that's quite a free and open environment that can be very beneficial. So there's no controls in this scenario. We can install the software that we want, we can do the analysis that we want. And so from a researcher's point of view, this is a great scenario to be in. And then if you say, well, we've now got data in multiple environments, we still don't have many restrictions. We can still connect different environments up to each other. We can run software in each environment. And we can run through all those types of processes that we want to as a researcher, because we haven't got the organizational constraints in place that we might have with sensitive data. And what we've seen is a lot of the federated tooling has come from these types of ecosystems where there is more open data. And we've borrowed a lot of their ways of working, actually, around in the open space, this is how you do federation, but how do we now apply that in a more secure world? And of course, the challenge really is for a TRE, everything that goes in and out is controlled, everything that is installed is controlled, and in particular, when you're inside that environment, you don't have access to the internet. So how can you connect multiple environments that has no internet connectivity? And that's the challenge that we're trying to solve. So there is pain in the system. It's not ideal. It's not useful. So I have my 3 personas. I have Razia as the researcher, Trish as the TRE operator, and Harriet, the HPC. And so at the moment, you can do federated analysis. It is possible. But the effort and the burden goes on to Razia, the researcher. She has to work out, how do I get approval to go into each TRE? How do I log in? What environment will they provide me? What analysis can I do? All the heavy lifting is on Razia to make her research program work. Not ideal. But equally, for Trish, the TRE, she's trying to create a secure environment and protect that data and make sure nothing disclosive leaves it. But are these pesky researchers that come along and go, hey, I want to be part of this federated network. Can you just install this bit of software that connects on the web and can do this federated query for me? But there is no specification or infrastructure that says that's okay. or here's the rules of engagement or the standards for how you might do that. And then from an HPC point of view, we have the challenge that they have the compute, they have the power to drive some analysis that Razia might want to do, but it's not always the case that the HPC is connected up to the TRE. So how do you connect up the researcher with the data and with the right compute? So there was a report out recently from ABPI looking at the NHS England Secure Data Environment Programme. And there's some really important learnings and observations from that report that I think we need to really digest and take forward. Because what they are challenging is not the technology and is it possible. They're not challenging the acceptability of the program. They're challenging the usefulness. And what was really useful, bad choice was, but what was very useful for me when reading this was then actually what they've called out. What was their call to action? Common data standards and enabling architecture should be put in place now, because they know that's going to be a challenge for the future, and that's something that we have to do. But interestingly, they also talked about the need to have direct access to anonymized patient data, rather than kind of aggregated views of data, which is also something very important when we talk about federation. So, introducing Team TREvolution. It is a joint project being coordinated from University of Nottingham. That's why we've dragged you all here. But the leadership is between Dundee, Manchester, Nottingham, Swansea, and West of England, because we've taken those previous programs, successful programs, from the previous phases of DARE and brought them into one program. But we've also got all the other partners that are involved in this. And so if I focus on just a few of the challenges that were brought out from the ABPI report, 4 that really strike me. One was around importing other data. How do you bring data in? How do you get data out? How do you have one environment? And how do you enable direct access to data? So, on movement of data, that's an unusual concept for a TRE, because the whole purpose of a TRE is to give data access, not data sharing. So this idea that you're going to release row-level data out of your environment doesn't happen. But that is the current generic, the standard way that you would expect a TRE to operate. You come into the environment, we'll provide you access to data. We're not going to share it. We've also got to understand that there are significant volumes of data outside of TREs. And so DARE is a program across multiple domains. Not all data is sensitive. But what if you want to combine sensitive data with non-sensitive data? Then what do you do? Where do you move it to? Which is an important question. But there's also some challenges. If you're looking at rare disease research, for example, disclosure control processes will look to remove data where it goes below a certain threshold. So it might be in each TRE, there's only 2 patients with a particular condition, or it might be 2 people from the community that have a particular ethnicity, for example. You wanted to look at them and do research on these important kind of minority populations. Each one of those might get removed when you move it out of a single TRE. But as a population as a whole, there might be many hundreds of them. It's just that the data resides in individual TREs. And so when you take that data out and try to move it currently, disclosure control processes will probably remove those from the data sets. So that's current day. Where we want to get to is a framework in place so that multiple TREs can operate as a network of TREs together, so that we still maintain the important governance checks of disclosure control, but we're not still working in the same silos that exist at the moment. So where do we put that boundary? Can we move that so it's actually around a network of TREs rather than on every single one? I think what's also really interesting, how can we enable data controllers to connect their data to a TRE? Emily already mentioned how expensive it is to set up TREs. Do we need everybody to have a TRE? Or can we just enable data controllers to make their data available within a network of TREs? And importantly, around disclosure control, we need to understand what are the risk thresholds? How do we do that as a collective rather than as individuals at an individual TRE perspective? So then thinking about access to a single environment. Currently, there are tools that might make that easier, but Razzie, the researcher, still has to go into each individual environment, one by one, do the analysis, and pull that data out. Each environment has different tools. So there's a Coalesce study, for example, and there's been many other kind of national programs where it's really hard because one environment allows you to run Python, one allows you to run R, one allows you to... So you can't run the same analysis in each environment. You have to write your analysis for each individual environment, understand how you get your analysis in there, and then how you get data out of it. That's a lot of effort. So how do you create a single environment? And of course, with each environment comes that layer that I talked about. The layer of governance, the layer of access procedures, and the layer of disclosure control. So, what we want to try and get to is a single front door. How can you access a network of TREs by logging into a single one? Can one of those TREs say, yeah, we'll take this one because it's a project we care about. We'll vet you, we'll bring you in, but by being within one TRE, you can get access to multiple TREs. And that's what we're looking to do. And if we achieve that, you're getting access to those multiple TREs in a single environment, which also means we can standardize the environment that research is in. So we can give them the tools in a standardized way. But we've always got to remember, in this network, we always have to respect the different risk thresholds that each TRE may have. So again, there's this balance between what's possible versus what's acceptable constantly comes through all of this. Direct access to data. So this is the default operation for TREs currently. If you get access to a TRE, you will get direct access to that data. The problem is federated tooling, as in the tools that allow you to run analysis over multiple environments, do not default to that mechanism. They default to the process of you having an area that you log into, you write your analysis there, and then it sends it to where the data is. And nearly all the federated tools out there operate on that basis. That makes it very hard if you're trying to do your analysis. If you can't see the data, how do you build your analysis up? Now, there are tools and tricks that different people have used to do that, but we have to recognize what's possible currently and the tools that are out there are not necessarily what people want to use because they don't give that direct access to data. So we do see this conflict actually between the three parameters: possible, acceptable, and usable. So again, where do we want to get to? We want to bring in some of the understanding that's come from the previous DARE programs. How can we allow a researcher, via that single front door, to have their eyes on the data, to be able to see it, and to be able to develop their analysis with sight of that data? That's a very different way of doing it compared to how it's done today, but that's what we want to try and achieve. But also importantly is providing the researcher with the most appropriate access for the time of their development. So if they're very early in that phase, you might give them the eyes on the data. But once that's a reproducible workflow that somebody else can just rerun, they might not need access to the whole data at that point in time. So we've got to understand, how do we toggle this so that for some parts of that process, when people are trying to develop their tools, they might require greater access to that data. But once they've got that tool ready, you might toggle that down and go back to the more default way that federated tooling is working. And really what we're trying to do is achieve that balance between what's possible, acceptable, and useful. Standards. Not everybody likes standards. But I think in this space, it is a real way that we can actually get to a point. Oh, I've upset Rob, sorry. Oh, okay, amazing. So yes, standards are a way of actually trying to help acceptability. The problem is we don't have these standards currently. So it's very hard to show you're doing the right thing or this is okay if there isn't a definition of what okay is. And this is a challenge. So if we are going to try and create this network of TREs, what are the standards that would enable multiple TREs to be connected together that is still in line with governance? If we're going to have analysis running across different TREs with different environments, we do need standards as well that enable that analysis to run, even if it's not exactly the same environment in every single location. And that's really important, and there are existing standards out there. So when I'm saying standards, we don't need to build new ones. We just need to use what's there already. And one of the most hardest things until very recently was, what is a TRE? Because there's never been a definition for what a TRE is. And the challenge is, when you have a policy brief that goes out and says you can only analyze your data in a TRE, guess what? Everybody suddenly has a TRE. But how do you know that TRE is appropriate for the type of data that's out there? And so previous investments from DARE around the SARTRA specification have really helped to set the standard. What is a TRE? Where's that benchmark starting from? And actually a lot of the SARTRA specification has gone into the Entrust program because they had the same problem. They're trying to coordinate and create a blueprint for Europe. First question, what's a TRE? Luckily, because of DARE, they always say, here's a specification for what a TRE is. And it's great because it allows people to self-assess against that specification. The other challenge we have are there are multiple federated tooling out there, as I've already described. There was a paper out recently, something like 90-odd different federated tools were used in just a single domain for federated learning. We've got hundreds of them. They're all over the place. But each one operates differently. They require different data standards. They have different protocols. We need to get to a point that we're not constantly challenging TREs. Could you just install yet another tool? Again, there are existing standards we can deploy and apply to make sure that that becomes possible. We need to work with tool providers so they adopt those standards to make it easier to do that within the TREs. And equally, metadata. There are, again, multiple ways of representing metadata. So how do you know somebody's only done what they're meant to have done within the TRE? There's loads of logging that happens to validate everything that happens. But it's important that we have a mechanism for wrapping all that information up and being able to share that. So if anybody asks, there's a transparency to what's been going on in these environments. And so metadata is also a key one. And again, there's standards that exist. 5 safes really is the foundation in which so much of the TRE landscape has been built upon, both in the UK, but also internationally. That gives us a framework to assess the risk and to enable decisions to be made about who should have access. So we're pretty lucky, right? All the standards that we require exist. We just got to bring them together, right? But that's what we're trying to do. So, trying to bring all this together, SARTRA is a way of defining what a TRE is. So that's part of our foundational aspect of the program. What is a TRE? What do we expect them to do? What do we expect them to evidence? SACRO is a way of assessing risk of disclosure, particularly also helping researchers assess that before they go through the process of disclosure control. But it's really important as we're building these tools, we have a common way of assessing the risk of disclosure occurring more widely. So again, it's a very foundational part of what we're trying to achieve. And as I mentioned, 5 safes gives that unified approach to how we assess if an application should go forward or not. These are core foundational aspects of the TREvolution program. Something new we're bringing in is something called Director. This is very much based on the previous project from DARE called Teleport, if you're aware of that. But it's the engine that actually connects all the TREs together. So if we can have a single specification of a TRE, if we can have a way of standardizing disclosure control, if we can have a way of assessing somebody if they should have access to a network, that allows us to build a layer on top of that connects multiple TREs when you line these other aspects together. We also need, on top of that layer, so we've now networked all our TREs, we've got the governance sorted, we now want to deploy software to enable the analytics to move, because we will need to move the analysis to where the data is or to where the compute is. So that's what this software layer will enable. Previously under DARE, that was called TREFX, TREFX, and again, we're building on those foundations, but that's the next layer up. And then what we really need is mechanisms for packaging all the metadata that will be captured. How do we ensure that it's running on a TRE that's been approved? How do we know the disclosure control was done appropriately? How do we know the permissions that were in place for this research to happen? How do we know what TREs were involved by the director and what software ran? All of that generates metadata. So we need a mechanism for gathering all that up, and that's where the RO crate work from Manchester comes in. So we can use that as a packaging component. What all of that allows us to do then is to build compliant tools on the top so people and researchers can do federated analytics across multiple environments. So you can see how from the previous DARE program, we started to layer these things on top to get to a single solution. So the way I see it, there are some aspects of our program that challenge the acceptability of what we're trying to do. There are some that are addressing the possible. How do we make it possible to network TREs together? How do we make it possible for analytics to move? And importantly, at the top, how do we make it useful to researchers by providing them with the right tools so they can analyze their data without having to worry about all the stack that's below them? They shouldn't have to know all of these things, but they should be able to use the tool and have a useful experience. So last slide, this is the desired state. Poor Razia that was having to log in each time, her experience should change. She should be able to select the analytics she wants to run from the data sets she wants to run it on and choose the compute she needs for her analysis and press that magic button and it will run. So this is a digital transformation program because to make that happen, of course, we've got to be sympathetic to the current governance models. We need those foundations that I talked about in terms of SATRA, SACRO. They have to be there with the 5 SAFEs framework. So we have to reinforce for Trish, the TRE, that what we're doing isn't making her environment less secure. But we also need to make sure we don't encourage Trish to create a whole compute environment on top, rather than connect to existing compute environments that exist with Harriet. So that's an overview of TREvolution. We started 10 days ago. We've got 2 years to go. But I wanted to give you that overview of what we're trying to do, the history of it, and where we want to get to. So any questions?
Great talk, really useful model with the acceptable and useful and possible. So thank you. I still think there isn't consensus in the community on how the role of individual university teams doing that. You know, historically, lots of us have done our own DSHs and so on, and we're sort of assuming we always will. How do we best interact in this, in the imagined future between the role of national, regional SDEs, university facilities, etc., and in particular in a way that allows the different research disciplines to link up, which is the bit that I'm most worried about in sort of the emerging NHS policy landscape, for example?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I'll answer it from a Nottingham perspective, right? So both across the university and the local trust, we don't have a fully kind of set up TRE in the sense with all the governance models and all of that process that you need, the disclosure control. We don't have that. Of course, we have secure environments where we analyze data, right? But that's different to something like the establishment of some of the TREs that we've got here with what HIC have and what Sales CERT provide in Swansea, for example. But we still want our data to be made available via some of those networks. And that's the important part that director might be able to support is for a particular project, we can connect our environment up, right? So we're not now taking on the responsibility of all the governance steps because the front door TRE is going, yep, this is a project that we said is okay. This is a person that we validated and we're going to say, we're going to vouch for them type thing within this network. But us as an organization don't have to spend multi-million-pound investment of building an alternative to HIC or SERP or, and it also applies to the SD network. But we do want to make our data available. So, and that's what we're looking to do. How can we temporarily bring a data set into a project that is led by another TRE? And that also could apply for how we might bring in compute resource, right? So for this project, it needs that resource over here, the data's over there, but the TRE is here. And that's what directors trying to do is redraw the boundary of their TRE to actually, for this project, it's now got that compute available, it's got that data available, but to the researcher, this illusion's been created that it's a single environment. And that's a fundamental part of the program, is trying to understand how we do that.
So, good morning, everyone. I'm Phil, and I'm director of the Yorkshire Number SDE. And I just wanted to pick up on James's point, if you don't mind, the other Phil. So, we recognised that issue right back at the start of creating our SDE. So, 2.5 years ago, in our region, we already had 3 ISO-compliant TREs, all based in universities. So, our SDE, I think we're unique still in this. From day one, all 3 of those universities have been named delivery partners of our SDE. Now, the really important thing was, in October 2023, national policy around data access was updated. And in that update, it clearly states words to the effect that university and commercially operated infrastructure can be incorporated within an SDE, but will not be supported if they stand alone from them. So that's what we're doing in Yorkshire and Humber at the moment. We're thinking about what does that look like. And that's one of the reasons why we're so pleased to be part of the Panorama programme, because we're also starting to have that conversation across the northern group of SDEs as well. So we can't pretend that university-based infrastructure and expertise doesn't exist. We have to be thinking about how do we incorporate it within the SDEs. Otherwise, we're just going to be throttling back on the amount of work that we can actually support. So thanks for calling it out.
And we're trying to sneak the East Midlands into the north as well.
Yeah, so for us, the north of England, yeah, so it starts at junction 21, does it, of the M1, I think, in our definition of the north?
No, that's too south, no, yeah.
Thanks. Like James, let me echo, I think the dimensions of usability, possibility, and acceptability are a really great way to think about this. And so, I mean, thanks for that. That's worth TREvolution in itself, I think, that concept. The reason I pulled a face at standards is, you know, I'm a big fan of standards. Everybody loves a standard as long as it's theirs. I mean, that's the barrier that we need to get beyond. But I think a neat thing that TREvolution will do is if you like, move the standardization we need in technology to something that's going to be a lot more tractable. And I think that's really powerful. But my question, and this is maybe a question not just for you but for the room, is I think the technology standards we've got a very good handle on, and we will do that in TREvolution. How about data standards? You know, if we are starting to send compute around, then it's the data layer that will be the next big barrier. Any thoughts about where you might see that in maybe 2 years' time when the technology standards are all sorted? Where do you think the data might be?
You're trying to get me to talk about Rabbitverse, is that the...
If you like.
Yeah. Rabbitverse, didn't talk about that. We only came up with that name a couple of days ago, and it made onto a Dare slide, which is amazing. A lot of our background is in health, so we've done a lot of work on the OMOP data standard and how you can do some of that mapping in a federated way. Why it's called the Rabbitverse is because we have tools called Hutch, Carrot, Lettuce, Bunny, all open source, and so, yeah. And it's not our fault because Odyssey, that looks after OMOP, has a rabbit theme, and so we just doubled down on it. So that's the Rabbitverse. But then I think it's going to be really interesting in terms of why, because OMOP only works in certain domains, and I don't think we're ever going to have a single data standard that's going to work for all domains. I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question, and that's what we were starting to look at with Letters, which is a large language model approach to it, where you can actually ask the questions. You don't need to understand the data model, but you can get it to translate the data for you on demand. But that's still quite new technology at the moment in terms of how reliable that is versus hallucinations. So I'd be very interested to know if there are solutions out there. I know there's solutions in industry that have been looking at that as well. Who's got the mic?
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, Phil. I think probably everybody knows that the data standards are quite a lot as part of the NHS. There's a comprehensive set of data standards and data sets, and knowing about the taxonomy of the whole genomics and everything is already available. I think it was a 12-year work that's been done and it's been published, so it's open. I can say it, but that's a good start. I wouldn't say that gives us everything, but that's a good start to map against the data set that we already have as part of the research environment, and mapping against what's available there as a taxonomy, as a standard that's already been published. And in the meanwhile, some of the common ones, we did that, ONS Cabinet Office, so while I was heading up the data transformation in the Cabinet Office, so we did quite a lot of data standards thing, but that's for the common ones where it can be used across the whole landscape, UK landscape, specifically to the domain. And some of the ones I've seen it already available as part of the NHS, but then the thing is, mapping against them and evolving from there will be the good start. So each of those adopters have to work out to see that, right, we do have this kind of raw data, what does it relate to? And what kind of a mapping we do have. That report is what then will inform us to take it to the next level, saying like what more we needed. Rather than starting it from the scratch, we've got the open, we've got the data, what's available. We just have to do an exercise of mapping them and to ensure that inform back to us, which can then we can do another exercise to analyze that and do kind of a maturity assessment there.
Yeah, I still think though so the one is the standards, right? Is understanding what standards are we all going to get behind for the relevant data sets, for the relevant communities, right? And even within one community, I don't think that's solved. But I think the bigger challenge is the mapping, because that is still a huge piece of work and very subjective. And I don't think there's a good solution out there at the moment for mapping data. And that's the challenge, right? And it's a huge resource-intensive part. So and we keep toying with this in the federated space. So obviously for us, if we're deploying a federated analysis, it's so much easier if all the data's been standardized, right? That's like big tick, done, don't need to worry about it. But that doesn't happen that often. And therefore we start going, well, which one shall we pick? Shall we just, for health, is it OMOP? You know, but that's the challenge. But then if somebody doesn't have their analysis written for OMOP, do we just say, no, sorry, you can't be part of this network? So I think it is a huge challenge in the space. Identifying the standards, and that would be great to hear from the community as a whole, if there are standards out there that you think we should be backing. But two, how do we map them? And who has that expertise is the challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think one of the key things that DARE is trying to solve is this complexity and this diversity within the TRE community and community infrastructure space. I think the data space is challenging, and especially because we're trying to deal with more than just health. We have to be really careful not to get sucked into health, notwithstanding how important health data is. You know, we're trying to deal with administrative data, social care data, census data. You know, our partners include organizations like UK Data Service and ONS. And so we're focusing on enabling technology and infrastructure to be able to make those really, really interesting but challenging problems of linking data across domains easier, and then be able to federate those questions across a country, across the 4 nations of the UK, which at the moment is practically impossible unless you've got a multi-million-pound project specific for a specific question, And we don't want to be doing multi-million-pound projects for a specific question many times every year. You know, we want to be able to solve these problems once and then be able to answer these questions on a Four Nations way routinely. And this is what I think TREvolution is trying to revolutionize, right? We're trying to change the dynamic around how we do really impactful population-wide studies in an easy way.
Yeah, there's a question here. I think it's a question down. I can't see the sun is like.
Hi, yes, thank you for that. My name is Georgina Quayle from Our Future Health. I really liked the 7 components and the diagram at the end. And I was wondering, my question's around synthetic data, because I know that was quite a big trend or approach to solving federation. I was wondering, does that still fit in, or are we moving away from synthetic data as sort of the initial, I guess, querying, or, yeah, maybe part of data standards as well? But, yeah, is it part of the components, or are we moving away from it?
No, completely. I think it's still a tool that we can utilize at the right point. And I think it is that toggle that I described. There might be points where synthetic data is really useful. And it's about configuring the right environment for that right project. And so actually, if they can get going on synthetic data to build their workflow and then run that remotely, if they can do that, I think that's really important that we support that approach. And my hope is that we can then make sure the governance is balanced in the right way. So if somebody's doing analysis with eyes off the data or only using synthetic data, you would hope that the governance barrier might be slightly lower, right? And that process might be quicker. So if they wanted to try something, get something going quickly, that might be the way that you do it. But I don't think we can rule out the scenario where people, for certain types of analysis and certain type of work, will need eyes on the data, as in to actually have access to that data. But obviously for that, you would expect that bar to be much higher. And so it's actually not, I don't think it's either or, it's actually what's the right process for that project. So really, we're leaning really strongly into the 5 Cs, right? It's the person on the project for the data. It's really understanding that component, rather than saying, all federation has to be done remotely with synthetic data, or all federation should be done like this. We're not like trying to pick a side, but we know for some researchers it is really important that they have access to the actual data. But you're right, there are certainly scenarios where synthetic data is the best solution to get them going into that next step as well.
I'm afraid I'm going to pull us a little bit back to the data layer, and so I think standardization is really important, but with the other consideration we need to consider about data quality, of course, and what's the right balance between fixing data quality at source, because obviously the majority of the people who provide this data, whether it's administrative or health, they're using it for a purpose that isn't research, and they don't necessarily have the time. They don't want to be told, well, actually you need to change how you're recording that thing, versus curation, whether that's human and or LLMs. And so I think it's going to be an important consideration together with standards, is actually how we manage data quality appropriately. So we can, as I say, it's not just the data is standardized, it's not just everybody's providing OMOP, but that OMOP is consistent and useful.
No, completely, yeah. And I think that's one of the challenges of some of the existing federated tooling that's out there. They normally, I mean, this is making a generalization, but most of them are, you have to install their software, you have to convert your data to their standard, you then have to accept their governance model and accept the traffic which can move, right? So that inflexibility is why it's not acceptable to TREs just to install all these different federated approaches. And it is about how, again, I think OMOP is great, right, in lots of ways. But just because you've converted it once doesn't mean it's now suitable for everybody for every particular project. And that's the challenge, I think, with curation efforts. And so it's how can we enable some of that innovation to come in. And so I think on the first slide, when I talk about what's possible, it's also about how we bring industry in that might have solutions, but giving them the guardrails and the framework to allow them to come in a way that is acceptable to TREs as well. So completely agree on that kind of thoughts. Yeah.
Thanks, Phil. So Fergus MacDonald, I'm the Deputy Director for the DUK programme. So sort of wanted to get a reflection from you and maybe from the room on, you know, everyone in this room to some extent, and I was having this conversation with Phil Waywell and Kate yesterday, we've sort of drunk the Kool-Aid a little bit in terms of, you know, we believe federation is where things are going. And I sort of want to get a reflection from you in terms of leadership in this space, in terms of those leading the operations of trusted research environments, leading the investment in trusted research environments. What's your sense on where the leadership in this ecosystem is in terms of federation is the direction of travel? Do you think that there's a shift there? Do you think that's sort of starting to land? And I have sort of a second part of that question is, and maybe this is also for the room, where do you think the public's perspective is on federation, both in terms of understanding what it actually is, but also the acceptability of it?
Yeah. So I'll answer this second part first, actually. I think because we're still trying to work out what we mean by federation and exactly how it works, the challenge is when you talk to the public and more generally to explain it, it's still a very technical answer. Because we don't know exactly, you know, we still haven't completely worked out exactly how it's going to be. So I think there's still work to be done actually of understanding what we mean by it to help that communication. And that's not easy, right? And I think it's a bit, if you use the mobile phone analogy, right? It's like, who knows what standard is running to get your WhatsApp message? Nobody knows the standards underneath it, right? When you go abroad, you're federating because you've joined somebody else's network. They've lit you on it. You're roaming. You're still getting charged, unfortunately. You know, so that's federation. That's federation of systems. When I bought my phone, did I make that decision based on the standards and the technology? And is it this type of, like, I don't even know where the data goes, right? So I think we've got to be careful of not over-explaining the technical components of it versus explaining why it's needed. And I think in terms of leadership of federation, I guess we've been doing this 7, 8, 9 years, something like that sort of time frame. And when myself and Emily and others were involved in the Coconut project during COVID, federation I don't think was accepted then. It was very much a why on earth would we do this? And we were trying to convince them to do something they didn't really want to do from a TRE perspective. Research cohorts were more comfortable, so a cohort that could consent and that type of thing, they were more comfortable with this idea of federation. And I guess what's changing is the research requirements are changing, right? So COVID was a great example. It wasn't good enough just to analyze data in NHS England's or Digital's at the time environment, right? They wanted to do a UK-wide study. You cannot do a UK-wide study in one environment. You have to federate. And so I think what's happening is that what's useful is also changing, right? And because, you know, as science progresses, the first study that did an analysis on 1,000 people was probably the best study ever. But once somebody's done 1,000, you've got to go to 2,000, right? And now we're reaching population levels in the UK, as in people want to do analysis on whole population of UK. You have to federate. Unless somebody suddenly decides we're just going to have one TRE for the whole country for all data, which I don't, you know, my gut tells me that's not what the public would want, one big database with everything in there. So, and then the use case internationally, that's where Entrust is really interesting, because I think in the UK there is more of a political aspect. Why do we need to federate between Nottingham and Birmingham? Right? We don't have to. But when you go international, you have to. And there's some really interesting laws, different data protection rules out there where that data the data about the population never leaves the jurisdiction of that country, regardless. Like it has to be on a cloud provider and a server in this country. The data is not moving. So do we just say, well, we're not going to analyze data internationally now? So, you know, I think COVID actually changed the dial a bit, because the need to do bigger population level and international research really brought, well, you can only federate. And whereas previously, I think it was actually a question of do we centralize or do we federate? And centralization is easier. Researchers prefer it, right? But I think what we're witnessing now is science has moved and the questions are moving where we have to federate. There isn't an alternative. So I don't think we have to, it's not that federation solves everything. It's not that centralization solves everything. It's understanding when do you apply which depending on the use case.
That was a great segue into the question I had earlier, so international dimension. So first of all, thanks to Jonathan for calling out EOSCEN Trust. And I think a number of people in this room in the UK generally have had a significant impact on that European project, so it's great to see. TREvolution is an evolution in thinking in TREs in the UK. And at the same time, there is now law in the European Union on secondary use of health data. Again, it's a health data question, unfortunately. But there is a definition in law of a kind of TRE in Europe, the secure processing environment. Is it useful? That's a good question. But I wonder if your thoughts about should TREvolution engage more strongly? I think we have good links through Entrust at the moment. But that idea of engaging internationally where there are standards, laws indeed appearing right now.
Yes. But also, we have got international partners on, so unfortunately they couldn't be here today, but we've got partners in South Africa joining the program, and they've done some amazing work around a federated platform for the continent of Africa. And we really want to learn from them about how did they do that. Obviously, it's a completely different legal system, and the laws are different, but having people that have done it and applied it, and that's really important. We're taking some of the technology, the TES is one of these standards that I was referring to, Task Execution Services. There's people from Switzerland that have developed a way of processing that data, so they're involved as well from Switzerland. And then we've got collaborators also from the University of Queensland as well, who are doing federated programs in Australia, and we're looking to do that. So, but that's what you're basically touching on is, there's the technology, but how does the law, the politics, that change what's acceptable, right? That's the dynamic that you're changing. That's the toggle that you're moving. But we then need to understand what impact does that have on the other two aspects.
So to pick up on Fergus's question, so first I'll echo what the other Phil said about researcher requirements, shifting us towards federation. It's not an optional, you have to start to build it into your thinking. You just do. Again, one of the reasons why we initiated the Panorama project. But on the other part of your question about what does the public think, so next week, Yorkshire and Humber SDE are hosting a citizens' jury, specifically culminating in a conversation about federation across the group of partners that have come together to deliver Panorama. As far as we're aware, it'll be the first time that we've had this type of conversation across the SDE network with the public about federation. And the outputs from that will form the basis of the PPIE work that will then deliver through Panorama as well to build on it. So again, you've got to tackle these things head on. You've got to have an open conversation with your stakeholders, including the public, about what do we mean by this. And on that note, too many people use the word federation when actually they mean collaboration. And I'm just going to end on that one.
Yeah, and I think I'm right in saying this. So Open Safety, I think, also did a citizens' jury work before as well. It'll be good to see how that compares, because they do operate completely on that eyes-off model via synthetic data, and so that did get strong support because of that. They're able to move people away from eyes on the data and access to the data directly to not having access to that data. You can understand why that would be supported. But that does also come at a potential restriction. And I think that's what we've got to understand is how restrictive is that? Do we remove the usefulness completely? If we can still do the research that we want to do and researchers want to achieve, of course you should go eyes off, right? You shouldn't give people access to more data than they require. It's a concept that every TRE would subscribe to. But yeah, I completely agree. And we'd be really interested to feed into that as well. done. Thank you very much.